We will speak this morning about collaborative research in photography during National Socialism, the experiments of gynecologist Karl Ehrhardt and anatomist Alfred Pischinger. Victims of National Socialism were used for medical experiments, as we just heard, in life, but also in death, when their bodies were used for further research. And some of this research was situated on the boundary between life and death in research on fetuses. Here you see a map of Graz, a city in Austria in 1936. On the left side, you see the Histology Institute chaired by Alfred Pischinger, and about a mile down the road to the east was the Women's Hospital chaired by Karl Ehrhardt. Both buildings that you see here today look the same as they did back then. On the left, you see circled in red the windows of Pischinger's office at the time. These researchers published in 1941 side-by-side papers in the gynecological journal Zentralblatt für Gynäkologie. On pages 114 following, Ehrhardt talked about further insights from my method using intraamnial thoratrace injections, fetal organography. And on the following pages, Pischinger talked about on the nature of the child's breathing pattern before birth. The researchers had started discussing the normal movements of the fetus inside the uterus, and to investigate their questions, Pischinger then used tissues from fetuses that Ehrhardt had gained from abortions after he had performed experiments on pregnant women and their fetuses. Before we go into this research, we want to introduce the physicians themselves. Karl Ehrhardt, born in 1895, was trained at Frankfurt University as a gynecologist, and in that 1920s became interested in research on sex hormones, at that time an innovative field. And from 1930 on, he performed animal and human experiments on placentography and photography, that was radiological imaging of the placenta and the fetus. And from this work, he became interested in fetal physiology, that is the normal behavior of fetuses inside and outside the womb. In 1933, politically, he decided to join the Nazi party, the NSDAP. After Hitler had come into power, he also joined the SS. In 1939, he was recruited as chair of gynecology at the University of Graz, probably promoted by the SS, because at the time, actually, his surgical skills were not quite sufficient. In 1943, he started with coercive experiments on forced laborers admitted for abortions at the Women's University Hospital in Graz, and in 1945 he was dismissed. He fled from Austria to Germany. There was a criminal investigation ongoing in Austria, but Germany did not extradite, and the trial in Germany was dropped. He was able to continue in private practice in Frankfurt until his retirement. Alfred Pischinger was born in 1889. He had a career in embryology and histology at Graz University starting in 1923, and his research focus was normally on histochemistry. In 1933, he joined the Nazi Party, which at the time was illegal in Austria. He had a strong research interest on racial biology and taught that in the NS Kulturbund, which was a pro-Nazi cultural interest group. Despite his political activities for the Nazis, which was against the, at that time, ruling Austro-fascist regime, he was recruited as chair of embryology and histology at the University of Graz. And in 1938, after the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into Nazi Germany, he became a member of the SA, the Stormtroopers, and other Nazi groups, and he worked as a consultant on racial hygiene for the SA. In 1941, he also became a member of the Genetic Health High Court, Graz, an institution that decided over forced sterilizations. In 1945, he was dismissed, imprisoned until late 46. In early 48, he was denazified with a verdict of incriminated, and in August of that year, clemency was granted. And then finally, in early 1949, he received the status of Professor Emeritus, which was a full professional rehabilitation. He then continued with private practice and research in guest institutions, and in 1958 was recruited as chair of embryology and histology at Vienna University, where he continued with work on research on this so-called scientific basis of alternative medicine. For Pischinger, the work on fetuses was an exception. He built on work by Ehrhardt that he had developed after his radiological diagnostic experiments. Ehrhardt published in 1937 his first paper on fetal physiology, The Drinking Fetus. You see here a radiograph of a 6-month fetus. Ehrhardt performed abortions on women admitted for abortion, but he actually delayed the abortion after he had injected the radioactive contrast material Thoratrast into the uterus. He then took multiple radiographs of the pregnant woman and of the uterus inside, of the fetus in and outside the womb, and he interpreted the shading of the fetus's organs as signs of active drinking function. The so-called research subjects were a 21-year-old unmarried woman diagnosed with so-called congenital feeble-mindedness and her fetus aborted for eugenic reasons. In 1941, then, we have the collaborative study where now the researchers look at the breathing function of the fetus. Ehrhardt argued that the fetus breathes in the womb. However, Pischinger disagreed. From his histological studies, he thought that the movements that Ehrhardt observed were not normal, but they were actually caused by the irritant nature of the radiographic contrast material. So Pischinger suggested using a different technique with India ink as a contrast material, which had only been used in animal experiments up to that point in time. For Pischinger, this was the first and last publication on fetal physiology, but Ehrhardt continued with experiments on pregnant women and fetuses. His last publication on the subject came out in 1945. He talked again about the question whether the child breathes in the womb. At that point, he looked at not only at an early fetus, but also at a nearly full-term child. And he claimed that he was the first to describe this fetal breathing movement. Indeed, there had been other research groups that had done similar research on their own sets of aborted fetuses. In this paper, he did not give any information on so-called research subjects, but there is a strong evidence that he used 2 fetuses from coercive abortions of forced laborers performed in very late pregnancy. And that brings us to the research subjects, and Gabriele Czarnowski will take over here.
So, who were the women used by these scientists as research material for their experiments? In their 1941 articles, Ehrhardt and Pischinger differ somewhat in their description of the patients. Ehrhardt wrote about women for whom an abortion was planned for medical or eugenic reasons. Pischinger wrote about women for whom abortion and sterilization for eugenic reasons was planned. So the information on the patients was incomplete and partly contradictory. Unfortunately, the women's hospital files do not exist any longer, but some of the relevant patient data can be reconstructed from other sources. First of all, the status records. Here we find, looking at the time frame from Pischinger's and Ehrhardt's experiments and publications in January 1941, 5 forced sterilizations until late 1940, and only 1 of them was in combination with the termination of pregnancy. Rosa S., a single and unemployed woman, was admitted on August 13, 5 days before her 22nd birthday. The sterilization and the abortion were performed 3 days later, and Rosa was discharged after a fortnight. Looking at all notes on women with abortion in the patients, at the women's hospital after Ehrhardt's arrival from Graz, we find for 1940 about 560 entries in the status records, including all forms from stillbirths at home or in the hospital to induced abortions. There was a multitude of fetuses available in the women's hospital, including those from medical abortions. Additional significant information comes from the death records of the city of Graz, which not only list deceased neonates, children, and adults, but also miscarriages with the names of their mothers. In 1940, a total of 271 miscarried or aborted fetuses were recorded by the state hospital, 17 of them marked as scientific purpose, plus 19 in 1939 since Ehrhardt had come to Graz. Here you see a section of the Graz death registers with entries for 3 fetuses used for scientific purposes. Here it is marked. As recorded in February 1940, they could not stem from eugenic abortions, since the first forced sterilization connected with an abortion at the women's hospital took place in August. It remains unclear which of these fetuses recorded in the death records were the ones used by Pischinger and Ehrhardt. There were at least 13 patients mentioned in their papers. Whereas for Pischinger, the research on fetal physiology was completed with a publication in 1941, this was not the case for Ehrhardt. We do not know if he experimented on pregnant women admitted for forced sterilization in the following years. Most of these procedures at the women's hospital, altogether 118, were performed in 1941 and 1942, at least 8 of them with an abortion. But from the spring of 1943 until the end of war, he had control over and access to a new group of patients. Forced laborers from Poland and the countries of the former Soviet Union, classified as Eastern workers, which were coerced to undergo an abortion on racial grounds. About 500 of these involuntary patients could be identified at the women's hospital in Graz. Here you see a reproduction from the outpatient book from February 1944. Natalia A., 26 years old, working on a farm. She came for abortion interruption, permission by the Reichsphysician's Chamber in February 1944, in the 8th month of pregnancy, yet she is admitted. The last menstruation 6 months ago with question mark. In one surviving original research protocol designed by Ehrhardt, documents his unscrupulous use and abuse of the involuntary patients. It describes experiments on 85 pregnant women and girls from the Ukraine, Russia, and Poland, and reveals how Ehrhardt performed radiological and pharmacological studies simultaneously on these patients, who had agreed to the abortion only under pressure and, moreover, had not been informed about the exact procedures of their consequences. In this protocol, we find Natalia again, born in Rauchivka, not yet identified town, pregnant for the first time in the 8th month of pregnancy. Amnial injection of the radioactive contrast media Umbrator, fetal heart tones present. A Steinsche Kur enema to accelerate delivery after 2 days. A second amnial injection with formalin, fetal heart tones no longer present. Again, a Steinsche Kur, no success. After 2 days, evacuation with turning of fetus. In fact, she had been pregnant with twins. The practices performed at the Graz University Women's Hospital are an example of medical atrocities not only in camps, but also in civilian hospitals. In the first years, there existed no clearly delineated border between the abuse of NS victims of forced sterilization and that of other patients. The transition from one group to the other were fluent and followed an older tradition which treated poor and disenfranchised patients as material for research and medical education. Oh, I have to do some more. Thank you. This changed with the advent and the growing number of pregnant forced laborers admitted for abortions, which were performed up to the latest stages of pregnancy. In National Socialism, it was not only economic and social, but also the racial difference that led to an unprecedented increase and use of patient material. So we come to some points of discussion. Concerning the experiments and questions of ethical transgressions, we would like to point out the following aspects. Ethical transgression did not necessarily lie in fetal research itself, which was performed also by other researchers and not considered unethical at that time. Another point is the infliction of physical harm on women and their children, though through non-therapeutic application of radiation and mutagenic cancerogenic substances, and more generally, the problem of taking patients as research subjects for granted, then and now. A basic problem is the coerced consent in forced abortions. Finally, what about scientific opportunism? Pischinger performed research outside his usual fields of interest because new material became available in abundance through Ehrhardt's activities. Concerning post-war history, the perpetrators and the victims. The perpetrators. After a short denazification period, both Ehrhardt and Pischinger were professionally active in private practice. Pischinger pursued his academic career in Vienna and became known for his work in alternative medicine. The victims, nobody recorded the ordeal of these women, their losses and suffering. Their history was only uncovered in the last years. Recognition, compensation. None of the women abused by Ehrhardt applied for compensation from the Austrian Fund for Reconciliation. Memorialization. For years, the Graz Women's University Hospital has had plans for the installation of a memorial plaque, but nothing has happened yet. We come to our conclusion. A consideration for the humanity of their research objects by Ehrhardt and Pischinger was generally not part of the scientific calculation, as photography itself and dissection of unclaimed bodies, including stillbirths and fetuses, were internationally accepted methodology at the scientific community at the time. However, the experimentation on victims of forced abortions is as of now unique, even in the history of medicine in NS Germany and Austria. Under the conditions created by the nationalist socialist regime, all manner of transgressions were committed by those scientists who were prepared to cross the traditional boundaries of research ethics between life and death. Thank you.